Life during the 1940s was dominated by the raging conflict of World War II. While many people came together to help each other through these difficult times, crime was still rampant. And although death may have been an ever-present threat, there were still those who turned to murder. In today's episode, we explore 5 such cases. In the summer of 1943, the Second World War was in full swing, and experiencing enemy action wasn't uncommon for the people of England. But when an explosion interrupted lunchtime in Rayleigh on July the 23rd, there had not been prior warning or any sign of impending attack. Although some residents had witnessed an aircraft flying in the vicinity of the town centre that afternoon, enemy action was soon ruled out. When authorities arrived at the scene, they discovered a badly injured woman and a mix of metal and human remains. This was all that remained of Archibald Brown and his wheelchair. The Browns were a family of 4 who lived on London Hill in Rayleigh. The father, 47-year-old Archibald, had served 3 years in the army during the Great War before becoming a successful miner. That career, however, ended when Archibald damaged his spine and lost the use of his legs in a motorcycle accident at the age of 24. Since that accident, Archibald had been confined to a bath chair, a luxurious type of wheelchair. A bath chair was designed to be more like a rolling chaise or light carriage, so it had a folding hood that could be opened or closed depending on the weather. While the bath chair was usually pushed by hand, 4-wheeled versions could be drawn by a horse or a pony. After his accident, Archibald's behaviour changed, and over the years he became a bitter and angry man who ruled his family with a rod of iron. Despite being dependent on others' help, Archibald treated his wife Doris and their 2 sons terribly. Doris Brown found she was not allowed to do anything without her husband's permission, not even visit her mother in nearby Rockford. Archibald would constantly ring his bell for any minor inconvenience, forcing Doris to hurry to him no matter what she was doing, sometimes just to change the position of a flower arrangement in their home because her husband didn't like it. The couple's eldest son, 19-year-old Eric, had been abused by his father both verbally and physically for most of his life. Even after joining the army, it seemed like Eric could not escape his father's tyranny. On July the 23rd, 1943, at about 1:45 p.m, one of Archibald's 3 nurses, Doris Irene Mitchell, went to the air raid shelter to get the bath chair, only to find the door locked from the inside. She then went to get Mrs. Brown, and as they returned to the shelter, they met Eric, who was home on compassionate leave from his army unit in Spilsbury, coming out of it. Thinking nothing of it, the 2 women wheeled the chair to the house and helped Archibald to get in. After being made comfortable with pillows and blankets, Nurse Doris and Archibald left the house and began travelling along Hockley Road. They had gone about a mile when Archibald wanted a cigarette, so Doris stopped for a brief moment to light it, before returning behind the chair and resuming pushing. She had barely taken a few steps when a violent explosion sent her crashing to the ground. Archibald and his chair were gone. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Doris barely conscious with severe injuries on her legs. In turn, Archibald's legs were discovered, one hanging 15 feet high in a tree and the other 48 feet away in a front garden. More pieces of his body were found on the sides of the road, in addition to what was left of his wheelchair. While enemy action was naturally suspected due to the ongoing war, it was quickly ruled out. The investigators determined that the cause of the explosion was a British Hawkins grenade, a type of anti-tank mine. Someone had placed the device that detonates when an acid-filled glass capsule is broken under the cushion of the bath chair. The list of people who had access to Archibald's chair was quite short, and his wife was the first one to be interviewed at Rayleigh police station. Doris was open about her husband's cruel nature, how Archibald constantly beat and humiliated their son Eric, and how he had lately grown increasingly hateful toward her. Both Doris and Eric had noticed how much Archibald liked his new nurse and their walks together, and though she may have suspected an affair between the two, the police were soon convinced that Doris Brown had nothing to do with her husband's death. Eric, on the other hand, was a private who had not just access to a weapons store in Spilsby, but had recently attended a lecture on the British Hawkins grenade. Eric would have known how to adapt the pressure plate of the mine so that it exploded from the weight of a human body. Furthermore, Eric was said to suffer from mood swings, and he had lost a job at Barclays Bank in Rockford due to his bizarre behaviour a year prior. It has been suggested that Eric was pressured during his questioning by the chief inspector, who allegedly told him things could be worse for his mother if Eric didn't confess to his father's murder. Whether or not these allegations were true, Eric eventually admitted he placed the grenade in Archibald's chair, saying, "I decided that the only real way in which my mother could lead a normal life and my father to be released from his sufferings was for him to die mercifully." Following his confession, Eric was arrested and charged with murder, which back in 1943 was a capital offence. In November, Eric pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. One of the defences, doctors diagnosed him as schizophrenic. Another disagreed with that diagnosis, but said that Eric was suicidal and had attempted to cut his own throat in prison. In the end, the jury at Shire Hall, Chelmsford, found Eric Brown guilty of his father's murder, but also legally insane. He was sentenced to be detained during Her Majesty's pleasure. Eric was eventually released in 1975 after 32 years in an asylum. Despite the Rayleigh bath chair murder being an open and shut case, some questions remain unanswered to this day. We know that Eric altered the pressure plate, but why did the grenade not explode immediately when Archibald was first lowered onto the chair? If that had happened, the explosion could have killed not just Eric's father, but his mother and the nurse. It seems that Eric was ready to sacrifice nurse Doris Mitchell to get rid of his father, and only got incredibly lucky that the mine exploded far from his mother when Archibald shifted his weight to get a cigarette out of his pocket. It is often said that in the most successful relationships, romantic or platonic, partners bring out the best in each other. But every now and then it happens that two people meet and only trigger the revelation of the deepest, darkest and most outrageous sides of human nature. While these individuals may be happy together, those around them may suffer greatly. Bonnie and Clyde are one of the most infamous examples of the result of such a relationship. But today we are talking about their British counterparts, Elizabeth Jones and Karl Hulten. It all began on one Tuesday afternoon, October the 3rd, 1944, in the Black and White Cafe on Queen Caroline Street, Hammersmith, Broadway, where 18-year-old Elizabeth Maud Jones was spending time with her friend Len Bexley. Originally from Wales, Elizabeth ran away from home to be with her father, who was in the military when she was 13 years old, resulting in her being labelled as uncontrollable and sent to an approved school, a place akin to a youth detention centre. 3 years later, at 16, she left the institution and soon after married a soldier, Stanley Jones, who was 10 years her senior. The marriage only lasted a brief time as Elizabeth left her husband after claiming Stanley had violently abused her on their wedding day. To start a new chapter in her life, Elizabeth moved to London in January 1943. She worked odd jobs as a barmaid, usherette and waitress before becoming a club dancer under the name of Georgina Grayson. But it seemed that adversity was following Elizabeth as she lost her job in the spring of 1944 and was living solely on a separation allowance from her ex-husband. So when she sat with her friend at Black and White Cafe later that year, Elizabeth was still searching for purpose, not knowing that her life was just about to be changed forever. That afternoon, Len Bexley introduced Elizabeth to a man who said his name was Ricky Allen. This person spoke with Elizabeth, telling her he was a second lieutenant of the US Army, which impressed the young woman greatly. In reality, however, Ricky Allen didn't exist. The young man's real name was Karl Gustav Hulten. While born in Sweden, Karl grew up in Massachusetts and worked odd jobs after school before joining the United States Army following the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Even though that part of Karl's story was true, he was not a second lieutenant, but a private. On top of that, after being sent to England for the D-Day invasion of Europe, Karl decided that the army was not for him after all. So one day, around 6 weeks before he met Elizabeth, Karl took a large military truck and deserted. Somewhere along the way, Karl created this fake identity for himself as a paratrooper, Lieutenant Ricky Allen, a Chicago gangster sent by Al Capone to take over the Limey rackets. As it happens, Elizabeth didn't just believe Karl's wild stories, but responded by projecting an equally false image to him. Although Elizabeth's career as a dancer had failed, she told Karl she was Georgina Grayson, a top-flight showgirl awaiting a promised call for a screen test. The two hit it off immediately without realizing neither actually knew who the other person was. Living in their fantasy world, Elizabeth and Karl arranged to meet again later that Tuesday evening. But when Elizabeth arrived for their date at the Broadway cinema at 11:30 p.m. as agreed, there were no signs of Karl. Thinking that the lieutenant had stood her up, Elizabeth turned around and was about to head back to her apartment on King Street when she saw a 2.5-ton military truck. Karl was still driving the very same vehicle he had stolen from the army. Even though Elizabeth may have been startled or confused at first, she didn't show it as she climbed into the truck. While driving around, Karl bragged about being a gangster with some business to take care of in the city, which just thrilled Elizabeth. She told Karl she actually had a secret dream of being a gun mole and living a reckless life of danger. It was a perfect match that would lead to disastrous consequences. At this point, Karl decided he didn't have to hold back and apparently revealed to Elizabeth the truck was stolen and showed her a pistol he had with him. A bit later, when they got to Reading, Karl noticed a girl riding a bike and allegedly yelled, "Watch this," before knocking her over. Fortunately, the girl managed to escape without serious injuries, while Karl and Elizabeth grabbed the belongings that she left behind. After that adrenaline-filled first crime, things quickly spiraled out of control. Karl and Elizabeth went to the movies and tried to have more traditional dates, but nothing could compare to the rush they received committing crimes. And so, on Thursday, October the 5th, Elizabeth suggested they target a taxi. And so Karl followed a cab out to Cricklewood that evening and eventually forced it to stop by blocking the path with his truck. But in the end, the plan was abruptly abandoned as Karl noticed, while pointing his pistol towards the driver, that there was a passenger in the back who seemed to be an American officer. Unnerved, Karl hurried back to his truck. While driving along Edgware Road in London, feeling frustrated by their failure, the couple spotted the next potential victim. A young woman was struggling to carry a large suitcase. Karl stopped the truck and he and Elizabeth offered 18-year-old Violet May Hodge a ride wherever she needed. Violet thanked the couple, saying she was heading to Paddington Station. She would have felt she was safe riding in a military vehicle with an American officer and young lady, but little did she know the danger she was actually in. On their way, Karl suddenly stopped the truck, claiming there was a flat tire. While Elizabeth then kept Violet's attention on herself, Karl picked up an iron bar and bludgeoned her head. The poor girl was also half strangled and punched in the face before being dragged to the River Thames, but not before Elizabeth took her coat and the shillings inside her pockets. Fortunately, the cold water was enough to revive Violet, who crawled to the riverbank and cried for help. She was soon taken to hospital and eventually physically recovered from her injuries. Meanwhile, Karl and Elizabeth continued their crime spree, which was about to make a fatal escalation. On Friday, October the 6th, just 3 days after they first met, Karl and Elizabeth headed out with more crime in their minds and flagged down a grey Ford V8 at about 11:30 p.m. The unfortunate driver was 34-year-old George Heath, who explained to Elizabeth he was a private hire vehicle on his way to Maidenhead for a booking. Elizabeth, however, was persuasive and George eventually agreed to take her home. To George's surprise, when Elizabeth got in the car, Karl stepped from the shadows and sat directly behind him on the driver's side. But no matter the rather strange behaviour of the stranger, George began driving towards King Street. When they were nearly at the end of Chiswick Road, Karl asked George to stop the car. When the driver then leant over to open the door for Elizabeth, he was shot in the back. While Elizabeth searched through the dying man's pockets, finding no more than £4 in notes and about £1 in silver and copper, Karl drove the vehicle to a ditch at Knoll Green near Staines. The couple dumped their victim into the ditch before returning to London. On their way back, Elizabeth noticed the bullet in the dashboard. It had gone straight through George Heath's body. Most of the evidence, including the bullet and George's wallet, was thrown out the window, but Karl and Elizabeth kept the Ford. The body was discovered the following morning at about 9 a.m. by a fireman heading home after a night shift. Quickly after identifying the victim as George Heath, the police realised his Ford V8 was missing. Ultimately, it would be Karl Hulten's arrogance that would end his and Elizabeth Jones' crime spree. The taxi was discovered behind an air raid shelter the very same evening by a police officer who recognised the registration number RD8955. When Karl then returned to the vehicle at 9 p.m, he was ambushed and arrested. The Remington automatic pistol used to kill George Heath was found in his pocket, so the police knew they had their man. At the station, Karl continued the same story he had begun with Elizabeth, claiming he was Lieutenant Richard Allen, which would have meant he could not have been tried in British court at the time. But the truth was quickly found out. Soon after, Elizabeth was arrested and quickly gave a confession during which she stated Karl had fooled her. While Karl still technically was an American serviceman, the authorities in the US waived the right of the Visiting Forces Act, and both he and Elizabeth were tried at the Old Bailey, starting on Tuesday, January the 16th, 1945. After 6 days of hearings, Karl Hulten and Elizabeth Jones were found guilty of murdering George Heath. By now, the case was known in the media as the Cleft Chin murder, thanks to the victim's appearance. While Karl and Elizabeth were both sentenced to death, only one of them would swing from the gallows. In the end, Elizabeth was reprieved 2 days before the execution and sentenced to life imprisonment instead. This caused much public outrage as the crimes committed were seen as being particularly callous and cowardly, taking place during wartime. Elizabeth was eventually released after 9 years in 1954. Karl, however, did not escape his fate. He was hanged on March the 8th, 1945 at Pentonville Prison. For less than a week, Karl Hulten and Elizabeth Jones lived in a fantasy world, playing their parts as a GI gangster and a striptease dancer gun mole. They just seemed to forget, or simply didn't care, that their dream personas still produced real-life consequences. Sometimes a crime case can seem pretty straightforward, especially if the perpetrator confesses to what they have done. Their story can match all the evidence left at the crime scene, the timeline, and indeed the cause of death. But one thing that can remain in the dark is the true motive. After Connie Boothby was found dead in a sweet shop in Reading almost 8 decades ago, her killer was convicted within a month. But the full truth of what happened still isn't known for sure. In 1946, Constance Lillian Boothby nee Dodds was 29 years old and recently estranged from her husband, Edward Teddy Boothby. The two had been together for 5 years, but something had made Connie pack her things and move back in with her parents. The Dodds had a public house, the Queen's Arms, here on Great Knowley Street, quite close to the town centre. Some 80 years later, and the Queen's Arms still stands, thanks to a transformation by the charity New Beginnings, which aims to help the homeless and those in need. Back then, after settling back at home, Connie began working behind the bar at the family pub and at a sweet shop on Friar Street in the town centre. It seemed like Connie was getting back on her feet just fine, and as the year progressed, she met someone new. Around August 1946, Connie and a 21-year-old man named Eric Pocock's paths crossed at the Olympia Dance Hall, London Street. Eric was a flight sergeant and stationed at Lasham in Hampshire at the time, where he worked as a driver for the 49th Maintenance Unit. But despite Eric being described as a very bright, promising young man with a very good career ahead of him, Connie's parents did not approve of their daughter dating him. One of the reasons likely being that she was still technically married to Teddy, who had refused a divorce. But Connie did not care. She liked Eric, and the two began to see each other no matter anyone's opinions. For a few weeks, everything seemed to be going just fine, but then tragedy struck. On Sunday, September the 1st, 1946, Connie was cashing up at the sweet shop, chatting with her younger sister, Edith. When everything was done, the two women, joined by Eric, headed to the Vaudeville Cafe on Broad Street for a cup of tea. According to Edith, nothing was out of the ordinary that evening, saying that Connie and Eric were very merry and laughing and talking. Edith left about 6:30 p.m, after which the couple moved to the Jack of Both Sides pub. There, Eric ordered a whiskey and Connie drank a gin and orange. The evening was normal and calm. Once Connie and Eric had finished their drinks, they returned to the sweet shop at about 10:30 p.m, but only one of them would leave alive. Apparently, at some point that night, Eric Pocock contacted the police and confessed he had just killed his girlfriend. As police constables then arrived at the shop to investigate the claim, they found Connie lying dead on her back on the floor at the rear of the building. Her arms were folded across her partially dressed body, and marks on her neck indicated she had been strangled. Upon searching the shop, the officers recovered a pair of blood-stained scissors, an Air Force cap, collar and tie, and Connie's handbag. Inside that bag was a crucial but at the same time a controversial piece of evidence, a suicide note. The message was addressed to Connie's parents and read, quote, "Please don't grieve for me because this is what I want," end quote. According to Detective Sergeant Allen's later statement, Eric had replied to his murder charges by saying, "Connie and I have been talking about ending it for some time. We decided to last night. I strangled her and tried to kill myself." Eric had a wound on his chest caused by the scissors, but it was so superficial that there was no threat to his life whatsoever. So the question was, had Eric really tried to commit suicide, or had Connie stabbed him in an attempt to save her own life? During his trial in the following month, Eric showed no emotion, listening to the pathologist's statement confirming Connie had died due to her throat having been gripped and crushed by the fingers and thumb of a hand. In addition, bruises on Connie's body suggested that she had been restrained on the floor. Furthermore, Edith testified that she had never seen any signs of depression in her sister or Eric. In turn, Connie's father was certain that the handwriting on the suicide note was not his daughter's. Still, in the end, all the strange details and the fact that Eric's version of the event sounded very questionable did not really matter. The judge eventually concluded that if two persons mutually agreed to commit suicide together, one to kill the other and then to kill himself, and only one of them died, the surviving one was guilty in the eye of the law of murder. And so Eric Pocock was found guilty of the murder of Connie Boothby and sentenced to death. That sentence, however, was later commuted to life imprisonment, and Eric ended up living almost 3 more decades before his death in 1975. Eric maintained his story of double suicide attempt, but so many questions were left unanswered. Would someone really try to take their own life by stabbing themselves in the chest with scissors? A far more likely scenario is that, for one reason or another, Eric snapped and began strangling Connie, who then tried to fight him off. It is possible that the official records contain evidence that could shed light on what really happened. But until those records are opened in 2047, we can only speculate on why Connie Boothby lost her life that night. As dusk fell upon the village of Hagley on April 18, 1943, 4 local boys, Bob Farmer, Fred Payne, Robert Hart and Thomas Willett, took their bikes and headed to Hagley Wood. The area near Witchbury Hill was part of the Hagley estate, making the woods private property owned by the Littleton family, who generally allowed visitors on the grounds. However, the 4 teenagers were not planning to admire the landscape or have a picnic. Instead, they were looking for dinner. At the height of the Second World War, rabbit or birds' eggs were welcomed additions to the food rations. Although what the boys found in the woods that Sunday afternoon almost certainly made them lose their appetite. Once at the forest's edge, the boys left their bikes and continued on foot. Several different versions have been told during the years about the event that followed since the official statements went missing in the 1950s. But it appears that at some point that evening, Bob noticed a blackbird leaving an old elm tree and decided to check for a nest. After discovering 4 eggs and realizing there were likely more nests in the surrounding trees, Bob told his friends to start climbing. Robert picked a rather strange and creepy-looking old wych elm tree, the appearance being the result of coppicing. Once Robert was among the branches, he saw a semi-enclosed cavity within the tree, and in that hollow space there was something that looked like an animal skull. But as soon as the boys were able to fish it out to take a closer look, they realized the skull belonged to a human. Needless to say, the boys were frightened and decided to put the skull back where it came from and hurry back home. On their way, the teenagers met Fred's older brother Donald, whom they told about their discovery. The boys eventually agreed to return to the Wych Elm to show the skull to Donald, but even though they realised this was a serious matter, the group was too scared to tell anyone, fearing they would be prosecuted for trespassing. So everyone returned home with the intention of not telling a soul about the discovery. However, it took just hours for one of them to break. That very same day, Tommy revealed to his father, Harold, what he had seen in Hagley Woods. The police were then immediately contacted, and the following morning the investigation began. After confirming the skull inside the tree was indeed human, the local police contacted law enforcement in surrounding areas to get assistance with the case. When the Wych Elm was then thoroughly investigated 2 days after the initial discovery, on Tuesday, April the 20th, the rest of the skeleton was found inside the tree, in addition to fragments of clothing, a ring and hair, while smaller bones were scattered about the tree base. When the remains were taken to the Birmingham laboratory to be forensically examined, it was concluded that they belonged to a woman. Professor James Webster described her as being 35 to 40 years old, mother of at least one child, 5 feet tall, with brown hair and noticeable irregularity in the front teeth and lower jaw. At the time of her death, she had been wearing a dark blue and striped knitted woolen cardigan, cloth skirt with zip peach coloured taffeta underskirt, blue crepe-soled shoes and mock wedding ring. Due to the fact that this person had been in the tree for anywhere from 18 months to 3 years, and she didn't have any injuries on her bones, determining the cause of her death was near impossible. However, she was found with a cloth shoved deep into her mouth, so she may have died of asphyxiation. Given where her body was found, the woman had most likely been killed and put in a tree by someone familiar with Hagley Woods. The Wych Elm, with a cavity inside, was simply too specific a place to conceal a body for someone who had never visited the area before. But who was this woman, and why had she been murdered? The investigators searched far and wide to uncover her identity. They contacted dentists, hoping someone would recognize the woman's distinctive teeth and abnormalities in the jaw. They also checked all missing persons reports and even traced where the shoes discovered inside the tree were made. But despite all the efforts, her identity remained a mystery. It wasn't, indeed, until March 28, 1944, that the Jane Doe of Wych Elm was given a potential name. That day, a strange graffiti appeared on a wall in Upper Dean Street, Birmingham, reading, "Who put Bella down the Wych Elm? Hagley Wood." Could it be that someone knew the woman and her name really was Bella? But even if that was the case, the police were still unable to make a connection with a real person. At this point, the case was already cold, and years kept passing without progress in the case. Many theories about Bella's identity and what happened to her have surfaced since the discovery of her remains almost 8 decades ago. Some say she was a victim of a ritualistic human sacrifice. This theory is based on the fact that the bones of one of Bella's hands were found separated from the rest of her remains, which can suggest an occult ceremony known as the Hand of Glory. This old European practice involved removing the left hand of a felon who had been hanged or gibbeted. The hand would then be dried and a candle made from the person's fat placed in the hand and lighted. However, if this was the case, the investigators should have found a preserved hand or possibly a candle, or the occultists would have taken the hand with them. But instead, the bones were scattered around the tree. It has also been speculated that Bella was a spy from the German Nazi Party or a German cabaret singer named Clara Bauerle. The latter has been proven false, as records were later found that showed Clara died in a hospital in Berlin in 1942. When it comes to other theories, they are just that, theories. Bella's identity and what happened to her still remain an intriguing mystery, and only time will tell if we will ever have an answer to who put Bella in the wych elm. The deathbed confession phenomenon is the only reason some of the coldest cases in history have ever been solved. Impending death can be strong enough motivation for even a hardened criminal to finally clear their conscience and bring closure to their victims' families. After nearly 7 decades of silence, it seems a serious illness may have finally brought an end to the mystery of who killed Margaret Cook. Just like her death, the life of Margaret Cook is for the most part a mystery. It is known she was born in Bradford in 1920 and was adopted by Dorothy Gladys Willis of Swain House Road in Bolton. Margaret apparently lived a troubled childhood without formal education, constantly running away from home and spending some time in a borstal. Around the age of 25, Margaret married a 24-year-old labourer named Joseph Cook. The marriage, however, ended up lasting for only a few months before the couple separated when Margaret moved to London. In London, Margaret lived in Soho and worked at the Blue Lagoon Club as an exotic dancer. At the time, the area was described as an immoral region of street vendors, restaurants and foreigners, and the Blue Lagoon was known as a front for prostitution, gambling, bootlegging and drug dealing. Margaret quickly became familiar with the London underworld and the local police, being arrested for such things as theft, robbery and solicitation. And although Margaret was a singer on paper, she was reportedly also a prostitute, an escort and a bride for hire. To avoid the authorities, Margaret began to change her appearance regularly and used different aliases. During her 18 months in London, Margaret lived in at least 20 different locations and rarely spoke about who she was spending time with. The local police eventually began to call Margaret Milady because of her habit of acting posh in an effort to hide her true background and identity. However, Soho and the Blue Lagoon were certainly not the kind of places the upper classes would frequent, at least not openly. Rather, they were hangouts for wastrels, gangsters and ne'er-do-wells. Margaret would have certainly witnessed fights, dodgy deals and police raids while doing her thing in the shadows of Carnaby Street. The very same area would later become a fashion hub in the 60s and undergo gentrification there on out. But back in the 1940s, it was a sketchy and even dangerous place. The fate of Margaret Cook serving as a grim example. On the evening of Saturday, November 10th, 1946, Margaret was seen walking the side streets of Soho between 8:45 and 9:10 p.m, wearing a brown checkered dress, a fashionable fawn coat and a bright pink blouse. Nobody knows for sure what Margaret's agenda was that night, but she was spending time around Brewer Street, an infamous pick-up place for sex workers. So it's possible Margaret was out looking for potential clients. At about 9:35 p.m, Margaret was again spotted, this time in the dark and narrow passageway behind the Blue Lagoon, where she was having a conversation with an unknown man. This person was described as aged 25 to 30, 5'8" or 9 inches tall, with a dark complexion, dressed in a Burberry-style raincoat and pork pie hat. The former policeman who witnessed the couple having a conversation couldn't say if the man was a customer, pimp, boyfriend, or just a random guy. But soon, the two began arguing loudly. Then, all of a sudden, Margaret shouted, "This man has a gun." Apparently, the man had told the former police officer to mind his own business before raising his .25 caliber pistol and shooting Margaret once in the chest. The bullet pierced her heart, killing Margaret almost instantly, while the unidentified man ran away. 3 people chased the shooter, but they quickly lost him in the crowd. Having very little to work with, the police surprised the public by naming a suspect in the case just 4 days after Margaret's death. Despite him barely matching the witness descriptions of the shooter, a 27-year-old labourer from Lancashire named Robert Curry Wilson was questioned and officially named as a suspect. But in the end, there was no evidence to link Robert to the crime, and he was soon released without charge. Afterwards, Margaret Cook's murder case quickly went cold, with no significant progress in the months, years, and then decades after the incident. For almost 70 years, the killer was able to go undetected before his own conscience forced him to reveal himself. In 2015, a 91-year-old unnamed British war veteran living in Ontario, Canada, contacted authorities with shocking news. He wanted to confess to a murder. The man told Canadian police that back in 1946, he was the man who shot and killed a woman whose name he couldn't remember with a Russian-made World War II pistol. The only motivation for the murder had been a simple dispute over money. Scotland Yard eventually interviewed the man, and apparently, although he didn't remember Margaret's name, he could pick her picture out of a lineup of photos of similar women. A remarkable thing after 70 years. As authorities have not released many details of the confessed shooter, we only know that this man had served in the army during World War II before being demobbed in 1945 and leaving the UK 5 years after Margaret's death to emigrate to Canada. There, he eventually became a citizen, raised a family, and lived a full life without ever bringing closure to Margaret Cook's friends and family. Only after he was diagnosed with cancer, at 91 years old, he felt the need to clear his conscience before meeting his maker. Following the confession, it seems British authorities tried to extradite this man, but nothing has come of it. It's argued that dragging a 91-year-old man across the Atlantic to take part in a trial where the only evidence remaining is his confession isn't worthwhile. But what do you think? Is it right that someone can avoid justice because of their age? Or is it simply not worthwhile for other parties involved? All we can hope for is that this confession has brought closure to any remaining friends or family of Margaret Cook. Right then, take care, and I'll see you soon with another story to make you say, well, I never.